What if the secret to finishing a massive tabletop project is deciding you don't have to finish the whole thing? We'll talk about that today on the Tabletop Sportcast. Welcome back to the Tabletop Sportcast, where we talk about tabletop sports through interviews, game reviews, and projects. Because the best sports stories aren't just told, they're played. It's August 9th, 2026. This is episode 263. And today we're going to talk a little bit about project sizing. And while we've talked all about the different t-shirt sizes, one of the things we haven't discussed is how to take those really large projects that we create and find a way to resize it using milestones. And that's what we're going to focus on today. I'm going to talk through one of the projects that I've been working on and show you how I've made a shift in delivering that project by making a milestone for me to reach rather than working on completing the entire project and the reasons behind that. We're also going to talk a little bit about real sports today. I've got some topics that I wanted to touch on for that as well and how that relates to our tabletop sports hobby as well. So we'll get into all of that today too. Before we do, quick catch up. So here's what's going to be happening for the month of August a little bit. Missed last week, probably going to miss next week for the episodes, taking a little bit of a break with some of family events and all those kinds of things. So we'll be back we're probably going to just do 2 episodes in August. This one, obviously. And then in 2 weeks, we'll have my anniversary episode. So we'll be able to catch up in a couple of weeks. There are some big events happening right now. They just had the World Board Gaming Championships. Keith Avalone from Play was there. And if you want to read all about his kind of experiences there, you can do so on the play.com website. He posted 1 or 2 blog posts, I think one to kind of update what was going on, and then a second one to be more of a wrap up from the event. And we are a couple of weeks away from Gridiron Games. I am going to miss this year's events, but hoping to get back there next year. And if you are, I think at this point they've pretty much booked it, but I always recommend this as one of the events that people should try to attend. They do a great job of it. Jeff Giordano helping to run the events. And yeah, just a great way to experience football games. And I think because of the World Cup, they've extended football to the international football, which many of us call soccer. So yeah, they've got that going on this year as well. So hopefully they've got good attendance and that everyone there will be having a really good time, because I think it really is a really good event, a great venue. And they, of course, just had the recent Hall of Fame inductees. So I got a chance to see a little bit of some of those speeches. And yeah, just really cool. All right. Around the hobby, not a lot to update on. We've got a few things in development. There's a few new seasons that have been released for different games. So go check out your favorite gaming sites. I know Stone Mountain Press has just released a few new seasons for hockey. I think they've got a few coming soon for soccer. Play has a couple of new sets out as well as re-releasing the Fury games, so you can go check those out. And Grant Fines has been busy getting a couple of seasons out, but like myself, there's a lot of folks that are also getting some travel in right now. So a number of our designers have also, especially the ones who are kind of running their shop on their own, have let us know that there's probably going to be some delays on shipping. It's just that time of year, right? People are trying to get out and about and enjoy time with family, and some of our designers are trying to do the same thing, right? So that'll lead to some of those shipping delays, but I think we're also, if you're like me at this point in the season, you're starting to look ahead towards the holiday sales and maybe saving a few of your bucks to make sure you're kind of ready for that event. And, I'm going to pick up a couple things here and there because I always will. But at the same time, starting to think about what things am I going to want to get as part of that holiday sale, and probably, not purchasing a lot at this point in the year, unless there's a new game that comes out or, some set that I traditionally look forward to. that I want to pick up. Like, if there's usually it means it's like a recently completed season that I'll get onto my tabletop soon. All right, let's switch focus now and talk a little bit about some of the events that are going on in the real world of sports. So I had a topic that I wanted to touch on, and it has a lot to do really with some of the recent news coming from horse racing. And if you've been following some of the sports news, you'll know that right now, like the traditional Triple Crown is kind of in danger. It looks like it's not going to be what it was going forward. If you're not familiar, the Triple Crown is like the premier series event for thoroughbred horse racing. When your 3-year-old horses, they have the 3 races, the Kentucky Derby, the Preakness Stakes, and the Belmont Stakes. They all happen over just over a month. I think it's really about like 5 or 6 weeks total. And it's the great test of championship horses. Traditionally, it was, you went to the horses would compete in those 3 races, and we would see if any horse could win the Triple Crown, win all 3 of those races. And of course, we had some of the great horses through history, Affirmed and Secretariat, right? Just to name a couple, Seattle Slew. There's been a number of Triple Crown winners, but over the last decade or so, I would say that has become less of the focus. We now are getting to a point where there's just so much money being made in horse racing that we sometimes don't even see horses even attempt to go for the Triple Crown. If you win the Kentucky Derby, you are all of a sudden a horse that can make millions in retirement, right? And so the idea that horses raced for years and years really doesn't exist anymore. They might pick up a couple of big races here and there, but for the most part, they're starting to lean away from the idea of running this Triple Crown. You also get a number of horses that might have been starting to skip the Preakness Stakes. They have decided that it's just too hard of a schedule to maintain to run all 3 of those races over the course of like 5 or 6 weeks. And therefore, you saw a lot of horses that were we get a big field for the Kentucky Derby, usually about 20 horses in the Derby. That drops down to maybe 8 or 9 that are in the Preakness, with some of those horses being ones that held out of the Derby to just try to make an attempt to get into the Preakness field, knowing that a lot of those other horses would not be back. And then some horses return for the Belmont. And usually that's a very small field as well. That has always been a traditionally small field of maybe, 6 to 8 horses tops. Well, recently, there was some news coming out that there's now a new union between Churchill Downs, who help run the Kentucky Derby, and the New York Racing Association that helps organize the Belmont Stakes. And they have come up with this new championship series that will capture 6 different races, extend the season a little bit, have purses that are pretty substantial to try to attract some of the top horses to compete through this new series. But the series is going to leave out the Preakness Stakes. Now, some of the underlying things that I've been reading about, and I am at best a casual fan of horse racing, right? So, but some of the news that I had been reading was that recently Churchill Downs attempted to purchase the Preakness. And I think Pimlico, was one of, the track that it's run at. I think that their attempt to purchase all that was part of a package. And the state of Maryland kind of stepped in and said, kind of killed that sale, made sure that their funding was available so that they could keep that track open and keep the Preakness Stakes alive. Well, in part, it looks like this new series is at least a reaction to that sale to a degree, or the lack of sale to a degree. And it kind of reminded me that, we've had some events recently where we start to see money being the underlying current, and it always is, but it really impacts the way sports are being played. At the end of the World Cup, we heard a lot of noise around the FIFA president trying to do some behind the scenes things to sell rights or access to the World Cup in a different way to try to bring in a lot more money. And that idea was kind of killed, at least temporarily. Now you have this event. We hear a lot about probably Major League Baseball going away as they get into discussions again. And that is probably going to impact the 2027 season. It seems like it's almost inevitable. Most people feel like there will at least be some impact and some games lost as they try to work out a new labor agreement, potentially even the entire season, right? Like they're at a real difficult point in Major League Baseball where we could lose an entire season as they try to figure out like a path forward, right? So, I think as fans of these sports, we don't necessarily want to always think about the money side of it. We think about it in terms of like the kind of contracts that players are signing and all those kinds of things. We also definitely think about it in terms of the ticket prices, the access to the games, especially with all of these streaming channels now, and how they are just constantly trying to bring in more revenue, which, they are a business, so they should be expected to bring in revenue. But that impacts our ability to enjoy the games, right? When you think about all the different streaming services that you need to be able to watch like Major League Baseball or NFL, it has now gone beyond just having like 2 or 3 public stations, like, the traditional, like I could watch CBS or NBC or CBS and Fox, some combination of that to like watch to watch the entire slate or of what was available to me for the NFL, right? I would always be limited to what games were available for those windows, the 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock windows. For those of us on the East Coast, you'd have your Monday Night Football, then eventually became Sunday Night Football, then it became Thursday Night Football, and now they've got games on Amazon and games on Netflix and, all these different services that are now offering up the ability to watch games. Major League Baseball, the same. I'm sure every sport will follow if they have the opportunity. So yeah, money does impact our ability to watch and enjoy the sports that we have traditionally wanted to watch. And this kind of like got me thinking that this is at least in part of what drives the nostalgia factor for us in tabletop sports, right? I think a lot of us there's really 2 sides to the coin. One is that we have those players that we grew up around. We have those players and teams, we'll even go and say, that we kind of grew up around, and we want to continue to see them on the table. And, a lot of us have sports that we enjoyed when we were younger, and we just don't enjoy them as much anymore because the direction of the league has changed, or the style of play has changed, or they've, kind of ruined the way we enjoyed the sport is no longer the same. And I think that definitely plays into that nostalgia factor, as well as seeing those players, seeing those teams that we remember. And it impacts everything, right? You may not like new uniforms. You may not like the new league structures. You may not like some of the new rules that they're introducing. Like all of those things can change the way that you've traditionally enjoyed sports. And unfortunately, a lot of times those decisions that come down can have a major impact, and it can be just because there's somebody trying to make more money. And of course, it's not us, right? So we have to view it and say, okay, I understand it maybe to a degree, but at the same time, like, do they have kind of a social obligation in a sense to kind of keep things going in a certain way? And maybe they do, and maybe they don't, right? And maybe some things are for the better, and they certainly appeal to a newer audience, right? And there is probably an argument to be made that keeping something that doesn't always make it appealing over time, even though for us, we understand that moment in time is what kind of made it work for us. So I look at things like, and from my own personal standpoint, I have, classic baseball teams that I like. Sometimes I still like watching Major League Baseball. A lot of it is always going to be driven by how my team is performing. So right now I'm not watching a lot because my team has been awful. But then I look at sports like the NFL, and I definitely do not enjoy the modern NFL as much as I enjoyed the classic NFL. The NFL that I remember from like the 80s into the early 90s, the style of play just worked for me better than the current style of play. So I find myself watching less and less football games for that reason. All of us have those kind of like personal takes on things. Some people look at the NFL and say, my God, this is such a better product than it was, 30 or 40 years ago. And they are probably correct in some ways. But, that nostalgia factor comes into play sometimes, and it gets us thinking like, I kind of wish this league was back what it was, 20, 30, 40 years ago. But when you make significant changes, money can definitely ruin sports. I think money and corruption really ruin boxing. I think a lot of us can agree to that. Boxing is not the sport that it was at one time. And if boxing had followed an approach that we see in like the UFC, maybe it would have stayed relevant, right? But it allowed it to be controlled by some people who wanted to make money, and they were able to take control of it, and that killed it. Time will tell what will happen here with horse racing. Will it start a new era that is much more exciting, that is much more entertaining? And was it time for a change? Time will tell, right? But to lose what was that traditional Triple Crown definitely feels like a kind of shakeup of sorts, right? And whatever it is that takes place, sometimes it's innovation and change can have good positive results. I'm sure some people can go back and again to the NFL, and right now I've been playing a series with the 66 NFL AFL, right, when there were two separate leagues. I think bringing those two leagues together was probably for the better of the sport, and having them continue to be separate entities probably wasn't going to be something that was going to work long term, and so that those sometimes the changes I think are good, but there's probably people who at the time said they've ruined it, right? They ruined it by bringing these two leagues together. But sometimes those decisions are for the best. And this one we'll have to wait and see. Right now, I'm not feeling too great about it, and especially hearing what some of the undercurrents may be around it, and that it's not just to try something new and bring some innovation. It seems like there's a storyline there that has a lot to do with money and greed and power. And that's the thing that doesn't really ring true in terms of it being more about the sport. But maybe it'll lead to something better, so we'll see. And we'll just have to let time play it out. But right, that's kind of like my take on it. And it made me think a lot about discussions I've had with others about that nostalgia factor. And, yes, it's probably going to be something that helps me drive why I'm going to focus a certain way when I do horse racing replays now. It's going to be about focusing in on what was the Triple Crown, right? And that'll just be the way I treat it on my tabletop. So, we'll see how it plays out on somebody else's instead. All right, we're going to switch topics now, get to our main topic, and talk a little bit about how we approach really large projects and start to set different milestones. So we have talked often about the fact that a lot of us dream big when it comes to setting up projects for our tabletop. And it always feels like when you're designing it that this is feasible. And we've talked about a lot of the different tricks, the tools that you can utilize to make projects where you can complete them. But every now and again, you're going to still come up with a project idea. And as you get into it, you're going to start to realize, wow, that finish line is really far off in the future. And I'm not sure if I'm going to get there. And as that happens, I think there's a really good trick that you can use, which is to really establish some clear milestones and start chasing those milestones rather than think all the time about the finish line. This works in a lot of different ways too, right? If you want to chunk things up as much as possible, and you want to get them into those chunks that you can feel a sense of accomplishment as you're going through a very large project. Maybe you want to play an entire baseball season. And instead of thinking about getting through the World Series, right? Maybe you think about just completing the regular season, or getting to the All-Star break, or getting to Memorial Day, right? You can chunk up the project and hit different milestones and feel really good about hitting those points. And if you're doing like a full season replay where you're going to play every single game, you might even feel good just like setting up really small milestones along the way too, like just complete that next slate of games for that day, right? All of those things can help you just have like those continual senses of accomplishment as you work through a project. So milestones are really helpful. I can remember even going back to like when I used to run cross country, right? And like this was in high school. Races were like a 5K, and there were, we would break the course up into different milestones, right? Because mentally it would help you to be like, okay, I've reached that point in the race, and you would be able to be like, there was a couple of big hills that we had to get through in our home course. So those were milestones. And then, I can remember there was another flat section that we would go where we ran right next to like a river. That was another milestone. Crossing a bridge, right? All of these different things. We would chunk the course up. By the time we were done, like that 5K course was broken up into like 6 or 7 different segments. So each one of those mentally became another milestone that I would hit as I went through the race. Well, a lot of times your projects can take on that same theme, and you want to start setting up those milestones so that like, okay, this is where I have to get to help me get through this project. And maybe it's like completing, it's a tournament and I'm going to complete my first round games. Maybe it is like that baseball regular season or some other, season that you're breaking up and chunking into different. Maybe I hit the quarter pole. First 4 weeks of the football season are done. All those kinds of different things help you set up those milestones. But sometimes, and this is what I've experienced recently, is sometimes those milestones need to become the finish line. The project I'm going to talk to is this 1973 Hall of Fame starting pitcher project that I started. Really excited about it. Had a lot of fun with it. But I also know like that completing every start for every Hall of Fame pitcher that was a starting pitcher in 1973, that's going to mean playing over 400 games. Now, I knew that going in, right? Like I knew that was the size of the project. So I never intentionally went into this project with the idea that I was going to finish all of those starts at this time. I know it's going to be a project that I'm going to come back to probably every year for the next couple of years till I get across that full finish line. But I also don't want to just stay with it nonstop all the way through, I had to chunk this up. So as I was building my annual plan, one of the things that I do is, as you know, at the top of my list is History Maker Baseball. And I like to have a couple of different projects that I will move through as I go through that. Now, this is one of the ones that I had made a shift, right? I originally, when I planned it out on the calendar, I was planning to do something very different with the 1973 season. But then this idea kind of came to fruition, and I said, this is a much better idea than what I had planned. So I went with this idea, but then said, I had originally thought I was going to only spend like 3 months on this project because the old project would have been completed in about 3 months. I think I was going to do a tournament or something. Now I had to switch focus. But at the same time, I only had so much time committed to this in my project. So as I kicked it off, I said, well, you know what? I know what my pattern is going to be. I'm going to play about 3 games a week. Let's just see how far I get in like 4 months. And so I set this like arbitrary time limit on the project. Here we are, coming up at the end of the 4th month, right? August will be 4 months that I've spent doing this project. And to date, I have done a pretty good job, right? I've maintained that schedule for the most part. Let's see, how many games have I played to date? 23 and 22. So 45 games in. 45 games in. And I probably had another 6 that I was planning to go. So I was going to get to about 51 games. Well, I started thinking about milestones and started thinking about this arbitrary time limit that I put on myself. And time limits are a really good tool for project management, right? But having that arbitrary thing didn't really feel like a true milestone. And so I said, okay, well, do I say 50 games, right? 50 games would be a nice milestone. I could just set this another thing here and have it be more of a cumulative milestone rather than just a time. And then I looked at where I really was in the schedule. And as of now, like all those games played, like right now, my next 2 games that I have scheduled to play, because I go back and forth between the American League and the National League. And my next game for the American League was going to be the April 20th start for Gaylord Perry. And he'd be home against the Boston Red Sox, right? So that's my next American League one. And my next National League game is going to be the April 25th start where Juan Marichal is going to face Fergie Jenkins. So all of a sudden I looked at that part of the schedule and thought to myself, hey, actually I'm not that far from the end of April, and maybe that would make for a better milestone here. And so I started counting it up and realized that I had already done, because what I've been doing is staying with a starter as long as their team keeps winning. So I did actually play a couple of games in May already, because one of the winning streaks that the Cardinals went on for Bob Gibson put them into, I had 2 starts for him in May. He got all the way up to like May 8th. All right. Well, going back, I counted up and I think I only have like 15 more starts to complete for the month of April. So all of a sudden, like I started thinking like, there's 6 months in the baseball calendar. And if I can get through one of those in this first leg of the project, that would be a pretty good milestone to hit. So that's what I'm going to do. And it's going to mean extending the project a little bit, right? Time-wise, I'm going to need a little bit more time. I'm going to need, I usually schedule like a session a week, and that session includes 3 games. For History Maker Baseball, that usually works well for me. I count them all as different gaming sessions on my gaming log. Like each game is a actual gaming session. But on my schedule, I always have traditionally put 1 block on my calendar and said, okay, that'll be 3, because it usually means it's like a series, So that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to allow it to extend into September. I'm going to push the project a little further, get 3 more sessions or 9 more games done. I had 6 more planned already. So that'll get me to April, and I'll be able to finish April. And then there'll be that little +2 on that with the 2 extra starts that I did for Gibson in May. But that'll just give me a little head start on the next leg of the project, right? And all of a sudden, it just felt like a much cleaner finish line for me at this point in time. So I knew, like I said, I knew I was never going to get through all 400 plus starts here. That was not going to be the original goal. And it probably is less. Like I just counted up how many starts there was, but some of these games feature 2 starters, right? So there are going to be some opportunities to lower that number a little bit. But yeah, I all of a sudden was like, wow, like hitting a certain calendar date in that replay will be a much cleaner milestone. And it actually gives me a good stopping point. Like I can get through all of April, and then I can put this project away for a little while, shift to something different. And then I can bring this back probably next year at some point and say, okay, now let's bring that project back and we'll do that focus again. Much cleaner approach. And it's one that I also took recently with the Face to the Mat project that I was doing with the XSE, where I wanted to get through the whole season, but knew that one I knew right away. Like I'm never going to play like 50 or 60 shows here of this wrestling federation. Just not something I'm going to do. So I chunked it up right out of the gate and thought about maybe do I do the last 13 weeks of the season kind of leading up to the huge event, or do I do what I ended up doing, which was let me just do those first 13 weeks. Now I can go back to that project and I can pick it up where I left it off and continue that season and maybe work towards the next big milestone. And in wrestling, you typically have like a huge supercard event like every quarter. So that gave me some kind of like milestone to work towards. That's usually the approach that I try to take is try to chunk things up into little milestones. I do that with my Grid Zone League too, right? Every month I try to get through another week in the schedule, and that means getting like 6 games completed every month. So those little milestones can be nice little checkpoints for you as you go through a project. And I do think if you've got a project that you're working on and it feels enormous, right? Because we do it a lot to ourselves. We plan beyond our means to a degree, and like you want to see that project through, but at the same time don't want to stay with it long term. And you need to figure out like, when can I shift away from it? Well, one of the ways you can shift away is to set that milestone and let that be a good stopping point. And then you can take a break from it. And then you can come back to it at a later date when you feel like you're ready to get back into that project again. And that's what I'm going to do at 73. Like, I really enjoy it. It's great seeing these classic pictures that I remember. And for me, most of these guys I remember later in their career, or watching, for some of the older guys like Marshall, I didn't really watch him pitch as much, right? Like I'm seeing him in this replay at the tail end of his career. But some of these other guys, like, I do remember, and I remember seeing them in the late 70s, early 80s. And it's kind of cool to see that, right? And to capture like, any baseball season, you're seeing guys who are at the tail end of like a 20-year career, right? And you're also seeing guys who are just getting started. So it's really fun to just see that as they rotate through all the different teams. And this project allows me to see pretty much every team across the league. I don't think, let's see, is there anybody that I haven't yet seen on the table? Yeah, the Atlanta Braves right now and the Boston Red Sox are the only 2 teams that have yet to make it on my table. And they are both scheduled to make appearances soon, right? So one of the pitchers, for instance, is Phil Niekro, and he did not start early in the season. So he's one of the guys that I'm going to get to at some point. And then the Red Sox, they don't have a Hall of Fame starter, so I just have to wait for them to face somebody. And of course, that will happen as well, because they've got a couple of pitchers in their own division that they're going to see at some point. So set that milestone, make it where you can get to a more reasonable cutoff in your project. And I think you'll find it more rewarding for you in the long run. All right. That is a wrap for this week's episode. We are going to be back in 2 weeks for the anniversary episode. Going to take next week off. No interviews this month just because the scheduling was really difficult, but we'll have some interviews back on the table for September, and probably back into a regular swing as we go through the last 4 months of the year too. So looking forward to that. But until 2 weeks from now, hope you keep enjoying the games on your table, and thanks for listening.